Art has the power to change the world, and behind every work of art is the story of an artist and their culture. What inspires an artist to create? What sustains their practice? And what does success really mean? Join me, Nicholas Roman Lewis, as I explore the inner worlds of artists, bringing you into their studios, their histories, and taking you beyond the border. Known for his near photorealistic paintings, Detroit-based Mario Moore tells a story of truth with every brushstroke. His works are a reflection of his community, which he uses to comment on the burning social questions of our time. From global warming and the dismantling of democracy, to Black love and the centering of Black bodies, hopes, and dreams, his paintings chronicle the extraordinary lives of everyday people. Hi, Mario.
Hello.
It's very nice to be able to finally sit down with you and have this conversation. It's funny because I think I told you before, I met you virtually, and I feel like I've talked to you virtually, and then I would follow your work, and then I actually never saw your work in person. So I have, just kind of known about you before I met you for at least a year and a half. And it's this weird kind of virtual space. But now I'm here, I'm in your studio, and it's such a delight to be able to sit down and talk to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being in my studio and seeing work in person.
Exactly. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So I'm always interested. You are a figurative artist. That's the only label I'll give you.
Yep.
Tell me a little bit about how you describe your work.
That's interesting. I tend to think about my work in terms of, I think for me it's all about the community and the people that are looking at the work, right? And you can call it realism, you can call it figurative work, you can call it magic realism, but I like to imagine that my process and the things that I make invite the people that are looking at the work, the audience, into the work. I think that's the most important thing to me.
To have an experience.
To have an experience, right? Because what I'm creating, I want people to bring their insight into the work. And I also want it to be able to speak to a really, really broad audience, right? And I feel like representational work and figurative work allows that duality, right? Where I can have somebody who's an historian or art critic or whatever that can dive deeper into the work, but somebody who might be, just rolling along, coming in from off the street, can also approach the work with some kind of insight, right? And I think for me, it's always about my experiences and the people that are around me. And mainly it has something to do with American history. So
I will definitely say you're a chronicler, right? And when I look at your work, you are chronicling, but I think it's interesting that you said magical realism, because from my experience with it, I think that you're playing with time. I see I see the work that is reclaiming history, but also making a claim towards the future. And with the Hero series that you've recently worked on, which is literally juxtaposing these historical figures like Harriet Tubman and others from the Civil War, correct, with modern, your friends and people in your life. So tell me a little bit about that specific kind of Hero project. Yeah,
so that kind of steamrolled out of I'm a believer that in the studio, right? The studio it's all like a science experiment, right? You're working, and from that work, you generate more work, right? So the premise for that entire series was thinking about the state that we're in right now as a country.
And what state are we in, Mario?
Oh my gosh! Look, what? Okay, you know that like right now, I think, and when you think about the Civil War, it's one of the most talked about moments in American history. There's so many movies about it. There's so many books about it. I mean, it's endless, right? And they keep rearranging the historical number of deaths that occurred during the Civil War. The number keeps going up. I think right now we might be at 800,000 as far as what historians say the amount of people that died, right? The worst death number in American history. Right now with COVID, we are 800,000 plus. So we have passed that number, right? And in the same kind of line of thought, what was happening politically is very similar to what's happening politically now. So for me, it's always a reference when I'm thinking about history, how we keep going in a circle. We don't pay attention to what happened in the past. So in that body of work, I was thinking about these moments. I was thinking about how important black soldiers were to the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And how we were so needed, even though people didn't want us.
Yeah.
But that's how we won, right?
Yeah.
That was the kind of impetus to allow us to, you know, pass laws and to make Lincoln, you know, believe that there was a reason that black people needed to stay in the U.S. You know. So for me, it was looking at these moments and finding these stories, and then to bring that to today. I feel like the best way to do that is use people I know, right? Because a lot of times we look at history as this ancient past and we look at it as this unknown. So I feel like when I bring people that you might see next door or that you saw yesterday, it brings that moment into the contemporary. So that was the kind of whole thing. And I was looking at these old Civil War photographs of black soldiers, photographs of Harriet Tubman, the youngest one that they discovered a couple years ago. And I was like, yeah, this makes sense to paint friends of mine in these same poses.
You know, it's funny because growing up, we only saw Harriet Tubman, I'm just gonna be real, as this old, broken down, like, oh girl, like, you know.
Exactly.
When in reality, she was this kind of bold, regal, you know, I mean, if it was today, we would be, you know, she's this freedom fighter. And that's why I think that your juxtaposition and bringing these people, this is my interpretation. When I look at it, you know, bringing these historical figures to life. I mean, you did that with the work you did, Edward Boucher, for Yale. And I think I told you this story. You know, Edward Boucher is, I think, the first African-American graduate from Yale University. And when I was there, it was just a photo, and it looked like, I mean, it actually looked like a friend of mine. Like, we would always joke, this looks like somebody we know, but it was in the past. And when you did his portrait, it was like, wow, this was a man, he had a whole life, he had a legacy, and I'm part of that legacy, right? And you are. And so that's what I think is kind of brilliant about what you do. And then in the hero work, as well as some of the other work, it's allowing, I think, people who may not have the understanding that they have a role in what's going on now, because I'm seeing myself in this painting, the whole representation fact. I mean, you do a lot with, like, there's a lot of children in your work. I'm assuming that your family members. What is their reaction to when they see themselves larger than life in your work?
Well, you know, family's gonna tell you the truth, right? First, you better get it right. And that's another thing. Sometimes doing, you know, commission portraits, you don't really worry about if the person's gonna like it. You worry about if the aunt, the uncle, the mom. You know, I did this commission of this DC court judge, and I was so nervous. I wasn't nervous if he was gonna like the painting. I knew he liked it, but his mom was there, and I was like, oh wait, okay, mom, what you? And she's, you know, she loves it, and I think that's the same thing with family, right? Family will let you know. And they'd be like I talked to my nephew actually, because I put him in this. I had him in a couple of paintings, but it's a painting where it's you know, the drummer boy, and he's like, Uncle Mario, why am I on fire? Why? He just kept asking, why am I on fire? And I have to explain to him, what this is about so he understands it. But, there's questions, and I think there's also questions of, the availability of art to Black people. Mm-hmm. What does it look like for me to go into a space or institution that I don't think is welcoming to my body, or what I look like, or the things that I see on the wall? But that painting really is about also, because that grows from that Civil War series, about the state that we're in now, right? It's talking about actually global warming. It's talking about the destruction of the planet at the same time as the destruction of our democracy. Because it's really a crying call.
Yeah.
Right? It's because ultimately drummers in the Civil War, which I think is crazy. You had the flag holders and you had the drummers. They would lead the battle, right, and kind of announce that the war is getting ready to start, right? And ultimately, they wouldn't be part of the action, but sometimes they might get caught up in the action.
Yeah.
It's mind blowing. Like, exactly. Wait, I'm sitting there. I want a gun. Why am I sitting here with a drum? But essentially, it lets you know what was about to happen, right? So for me, this painting was like, okay, everything's burning around us. Mm-hmm. The democracy is getting ready to crumble, but nobody seems to care.
Yeah.
So it's like this cry, right? That this little Black boy is kind of announcing that.
Wow. I mean, that's deep on so many levels. But when you look at the fact, my mind's blown for a second, but the fact that it's yet again, and I'm just going to say this, yet again, it's some Black folks having to tell whoever needs to listen what's going on. Mm-hmm. So thank you, Mario, for putting it in a painting. Of course. But the painting is also, I mean, aesthetically, it's stunning. Mm-hmm. It's very striking. But how do you navigate the message with the art, with the aesthetic, with, trying to convey that?
Yeah, I think, like, the thing about art or making, right, is that every creator has an intent. Right? And it doesn't really matter what your intent is. Your intent. What matters is what that person who's looking at the work is bringing to that work.
Got it.
Right? I feel like the idea of art doesn't exist without lookers, without people coming to look at the piece. Yeah. Right? You can create something for yourself, and that's fine. But what kind of starts a conversation is when people come and they look at that piece, right? So this idea of, for me, it's like, what can I do with paint that brings somebody to engage with what's in front of them, right? So I'm talking about, what can I make that has a sense of sexiness to it? How can I make the paint look lush? Yeah. How can I make it so intoxicating, that you really want to look at what it is, right? So when it comes to creating a painting, I want it to be visually engaging. Yeah. That way that you even, want to spend time like considering what's happening in the world, right? So for some people, they might look at that painting and, they start to question, okay, what's the fire about? Okay, this Black boy, that drum looks kind of big for him, but it looks like an old drum. So what do these conversations spark within you, and how does that kind of get you into the work? Because that's what it's about. I think it's like, can I make a painting that's so good that you cannot look away? Wow. Right? And, I think with that red and that yellow, it's red is something that really kind of stuns our eyes. Yeah. So you want to look at it. Like if you're walking past and you see all this fire painting, you're going to want to engage with that theme. Yeah.
People engage with your work, right? And you do so much with symbolism. And I was fortunate enough to hear you talk about that in a webinar once, and then I had to go back and I was like, oh, like what does this white dog represent? If we use like a Marvel term, there's so many Easter eggs, looking for all that. Talk to us about some of that symbolism.
Yeah, well, for me, I love art history. My mother's an artist, and one thing that was around our house all the time were art books. And I remember looking at a lot of my mom's art books. There was one in particular that really fascinated me, and I didn't know why I liked looking at it. I just loved looking. It was a Kerry James Marshall book. Oh. And as I was going through, I was like, oh my, this is incredible. It was so, I was young. It was so fascinating. And yet when I would go back to those older artists and I would start to read like what our historians were saying about the work, and they had so much symbolism, meaning everything within the painting had its own meaning. Like if there was a dog on somebody's lap, a kind of dog, it represented something else. If there was a weasel hanging from somebody's chain, it meant something else. There was so much symbolism, and I saw Kerry James Marshall doing that same thing. And I remember the first time I got my own art book. I was at Malcolm X Academy in elementary, middle school, and my teacher, Mr. Michaels.
Okay.
He gave me my first. It felt so incredible because I used to draw all the time, and you know, I was really advanced, and I never had my own art book. I just looked at my mom's.
Okay.
But this was my special art book, and in that art book, it was about this big. In that art book was a painting that I used to look at all the time by Lucian Freud, a painting that he did of his daughter. And it had these eggs.
You're going deep with that book, right?
Yeah, I went deep, man. It had these eggs in a skillet, and it was sitting on what looked like a drum, but it must have been some kind of a burner or something like that. But for me, what was so interesting was the connection between the woman who was lying on the couch and the fried eggs. And I was like, there's so much there just in that connection that you can keep looking at that thing and draw new conclusions. So from there, it was always, whenever I would go to museums and I would read more about art history, it was like, I love this idea that there are these Easter eggs. There are these kind of continuous meanings that just keep evolving. So that became important for my practice to really kind of push that.
Yeah. I mean, so that also means you have to do a lot of research, right?
Yes.
And then, you know, me as a viewer and someone that, you know, is experienced in this, it's just very delightful to kind of discover these things. Now, you mentioned Kerry James Marshall. I'm also going to put out there Barclay Hendricks. I mean, I think that you are most definitely, you're a part of this legacy. And it is a legacy of Black men who are fucking brilliant painters, talented, are not asking anybody for any kind of validation, that are simply doing the work that they were meant to do, which brings us to the council.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I will explain the council, and then I'm gonna let you explain the council.
Okay.
So for me, the council is your painting depicting 4 African-American artists, young artists who are, I will say, coming into their own and already, you know, just on their own, right? They're here, they've arrived. And so this is a painting that you've done that is inspired by a 17th century Dutch painting, a couple of them, correct? But what inspires me about this painting is that it's like, you don't need anyone. It's kind of meta on so many different ways, right? First, it looks at the whole research that you've done with history. So it's like, first of all, and this is totally my take. You may think something differently. But first of all, it's like, I know what the hell I'm doing. I've researched this, right? Because I am a part of this history, right? That goes back to the 1700s, right? And these court paintings and how they've done all this. And I am this is my take on this. And also, I'm not asking anybody to come and validate this, tell me it's good. I'm telling you, these 4 artists, I mean,
they the shit.
Exactly, right? And for me, it's like 100 years later, it's like you did this. Nobody else came and put this. It's like you were, and you're in it, okay? So you're in it. It's you, Jamia, Titus, and Mark. And I just think it's so brilliant because when you talk about representation, you know, it's sometimes we, you know, as Black folks, we can't, I don't want to say it's black people like that, but you know, it's like you don't have to wait for anybody else to tell you about your glory, your you know, your authenticity, and that's why I love that. So I don't know if I put stuff in your head, but you like, I didn't mean that, but like,
I love it.
You tell me about that painting.
Yeah, so the painting started, I mean, like I said, I'm an art history fanatic, so there's so much information that's just, I think, subconsciously there. But I went to the Smithsonian in DC, and they had a painting on loan from Amsterdam. And it was this Dutch painting. And the painting was so beautiful.
Yeah.
It was, I was like, oh my God. Like, it was, they had it on loan. It was there with another, I think, kind of group portrait. And there's this history of these kind of government group portraits that they did in Amsterdam that the Dutch painted. And I think what's so fascinating about it is the kind of way that it's painted, right? It really lends itself to realism in a very beautiful way, right? It kind of lays all the luxuries out, like, you know, the tablecloth is this kind of beautiful tablecloth that they probably imported because at that time it was very a big import-export space. So like the largest in the world at that point. At that time, it would have been
a complete luxury.
Yeah. So it's just kind of flowing with this kind of opulence.
Yeah.
But it also has a sense of power. Like whoever these men are, these governors, kind of control what's happening in that space. And for me, I think at that time, you know, I kind of sit with ideas for a long time. So I was like, I love this. I don't know what I'm gonna do with it yet. I'm just gonna pin it on the wall and I might come back to it, right? So now we're progressing and we get to a point where I'm getting ready to start to talk to the artists about this idea. And then we fall into COVID, right? And from that point, it's like, man, I would love to have a conversation with my friends. Like the idea of just getting us together and just talking about what's happening in politics, what's going on in the art world, how's your studio going, what are you working on? So it was like this idea in this space where I can imagine us collectively being together in the same space, even though that actually never happened, right? The painting is definitely an ideal situation, right? Where I'm together and we're kind of hammering, you know, what the biggest issues of the day are. Of course, you have the New York Times newspaper. It talks about the amount of deaths. There's the Civil War that's sitting there that kind of draws that connection. But I think more importantly, it also harkens back to a big moment in the Impressionist movement where artists were painting a lot of their friends in the studio. Like they were gathered around one artist painting, but you saw all these paintings where they're just nothing but artists. And then I think that's so amazing. I was like, I want to do something like that. And I want to include people that I have conversations with that also help me in my studio, but also are so badass in what they do that more people need to know about them, right? I mean, of course, Titus is the biggest kind of name in the painting, right? He's the most well-known. But Mark and Jamia, even though they are well-known in their circles and people who know them really know them, right? They're not as kind of highlighted as a Michelin or a Kahinde, but their work is so incredible. And their ideas are people that I go to, you know, some of the smartest people that I know, and we can just talk about American history. We can talk about, you know, the problems that we face in the studio and how to rectify them, right? So it's this great kind of notion of having community, but also this idea that artists kind of drive society in a way, right? That we, instead of the governors being there, right, we are kind of making these decisions on how to heal, right, a people or a nation or what to do next. And of course, you have the kind of omnipresent white dog that's in the background. And I can talk about that more if you want.
Well, I mean, again, that it counsels like you can take a seminar on that.
It's a lot in there.
On that painting, but so it kind of goes without saying that blackness is centered in your work, and also the gaze. A lot of your figures, their gaze is directly on, And there's one painting that that really speaks a lot to me. What is it? Not your land, or not your
not your landscape.
Not your landscape. And so it's just you and this beautiful lush green landscape relaxing. And so, as a black man, I could see so many people just walking by like, oh, that's pretty. But for me, I was like, it's kind of like, finally, like, can a brother just sit in his chair and like take it all in and just be? Now, I don't know if that's what you were painting, but that's what that's what I feel. And so, that painting, the gaze is straight on. Yep. You also have the other painting where you're in your winter coat. What's the name of that painting?
That's
what's cooler than cool.
Yeah. Oh, that one.
What's cooler than cool.
What's cooler
than cool.
Yep.
And it was. I may have told you this. There's a painting where, like, in Judecca, Akunyili Crosby, when you ask for a headshot, like, you get the painting. You know what I mean? And this is like, it was the same thing. And I thought, like, what's cooler than cool? Like, you want my headshot? Like, here's my painting. But the viewer is interacting with not just this really beautiful work. It's realist, it's figurative, you see the talent there, but I'm having to interact with a black man. And I think clearly a talented black man, an educated black man, and I'm wondering, in today's climate, how often does that conversation happen with people outside of our communities? And just like, so your work travels, right? I mean, these exhibits go around the country, around the world now, virtual. And so that to me, I just can't get over. It could just be my head. But, talk to about, that the whole representation element, which I think we hear a lot nowadays, but it really does mean something. And you and I, we've been to the schools and got the fancy degrees and all that, but it still means something to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly important. It's not only that, I think for most figurative black artists or representational black artists who are kind of coming out of the, let's say, the Harlem Renaissance, right? The Harlem Renaissance really kind of pioneered this self-representation, this pride, this sense of being and seen as a kind of proper human.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But
a proper human.
Right? I'm actually a human being, right?
Exactly.
But if we talk about the European paintings, right, that most of us have taken in when we go visit museums, the center of attention is not on a black person, right? The center of attention is on a European ideal of beauty, which is usually centered on a white male or white female. And the subservient subject of that piece is a servant, a boy with a little cater, maybe a cup of tea on it, or something like that, or a black woman intending to a white woman,
or a shackled child slave,
or that, like, right? During like a European bath. But I think it's from this idea and how we see ourselves, that's not true to history.
Yeah.
Right. Even when it comes to the idea of representation during that time, and I think this is another reason why I hate the idea of when they talk about black artists and specifically retelling history or rewriting history, because I think that's a falsehood. Because when you're saying that, you're kind of eliminating the idea of a truth. You're saying that whatever the white people did, that's the truth. What you're doing is something else.
Yeah.
So for me, when we think about the Dutch society, there was prosperous black people in Amsterdam. There was a very cosmopolitan society. So there were wealthy black people. And when you start to go back through history, right? When you start to go back through history, you start to see these paintings that have been hiding of like black princes and black queens, or a black woman and a white woman in the same kind of gown.
Yeah.
Both seen as kind of astute and beautiful.
Yeah.
Right. But those are the paintings that aren't on display in museum collections. So we get fed this idea of what the truth is.
Yeah.
Right. So for me, when I'm making my paintings and I'm thinking about history, I'm telling the truth. It's just something that you've never read before. Yeah. Right. And that's the idea of representation for me. It's like, there's so much there for us to kind of dig into the archive and pull out for people to see, because a lot of that stuff has been shielded from their eyes, right? The idea of the truth. Another thing that really is fascinating for me in terms of history and this idea of representation is the Napoleon painting, Crossing the Alps. That's a total falsehood. It's a total lie. That never happened. He never led the troops across the Alps. It was a black man who led the troops across the Alps.
Okay, let me get my notes. Okay,
Look,
tell me.
So, Alexander Dumas, the famous writer, his father was he was a soldier. He was a general in the French army. He's who led the troops across the Alps. So when Kehinde Wiley did this painting, right, where he copies or he does his version of Napoleon crossing the Alps and he puts a black man there, that's actually the truth. You know what I mean? But people looked at, I've read reviews, during, this was years ago, about that painting, and the idea of truth really comes into question when you think about it, right? Because people's idea of what is true have been fed to them. Right? So that just drives me crazy.
Well,
you know?
I mean, and I love what you do in your work, and you mentioned Kehinde, but clearly Titus does a lot of this, and I'm just now thinking about what you're saying. It's the truth. I'm not sitting here kind of retelling. No, I'm actually giving you the truth. And you're having to have this experience with this art. Speaking of the truth, you do not shy away from sensuality and love in your work. So some of them like, oh, okay, hey Mario, I see you, and I see your lovers, wife, I don't know,
all of that.
Situations.
All of that.
Just give me a little bit about that. What's going on?
Well, I think for me, like in thinking about art, right, and again, I can only speak from my experience because I am black and I'm an artist, so that goes hand in hand, right? There's a certain walls that you come up against, right, when you're faced with stereotypes. So when it comes to love, it comes to sensuality, the idea of representing that, I think for me for a little while was, I guess a kind of pushback against it, right? This idea of representing that thing. But also as an artist and as a human being, I feel like I should be capable of representing anything I want to.
Exactly.
Whether that's anger, whether that's love, whether that's friendship, anything and everything should be open. Because I think a lot of times the stereotypes try to push you in and hold you into these restrictions. Like, no, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. So for me, it's always the love and the sensuality kind of opens myself up to allowing myself to kind of rest burdens and different things on somebody else, somebody I can talk to and say like, okay, I don't feel like dealing with this thing. Can you help me with this thing? And a lot of times that's what is really going on in those paintings, right? It's like the idea of black men being able to rely on somebody else, right? Because I think for so much of our history and what we tell ourselves is that I can do it on my own. Right? That I'm strong enough to do this thing. I'm capable. I'm masculine. Right? There's these kind of stereotypes. And these systems in place that have taught us to kind of behave a certain way or kind of act a certain way. And for me, it's kind of letting go of that. And just kind of opening myself up to love, and through that, I want to kind of talk about that in the work.
Exactly. I mean, that's beautiful. It's really something to see that and to know that people have that interaction with your private life. I would be remiss not to, kind of a weird segue. Let's talk about your mom. So, you grew up in a household where your mother is an artist. Was your father a creative person?
My dad likes to say that he put the pencil in my hand.
Hey, that would be the same thing my dad would be like, I paid for it.
Exactly. So, yeah. My dad is he really loves antiques. He's always loved art. Mm-hmm. Right? I've talked about this before, some people know this, but my mom and my dad actually met at the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Oh, wow.
So my dad has always been engaged with art, has always loved art, but I learned pretty much everything that's dealing with art from my mom. Mm-hmm. Seeing her make paintings, make drawings, and just this idea of creating something. Right? Because being around her and around her household, there were always really interesting people coming over. Mm-hmm. We were always in some artist studios. We would go to lectures to make me be quiet. She would put a sketchbook in my hand, because if I'm at a lecture, right, my mom, my black mom, I better not be acting the fool. We're going to see Amir Baraka, you know what I mean? So there was, situations like that, but my dad was the one who pushed me to paint in oils.
You always had that support to, and was never a kind of a question that this wasn't something that you could do. Wow.
Never a question.
And when did it click in your mind that this is what you wanted to do?
I think for me, I was too young to remember, because there's a story when I was 4, either 4 or 5, and I was doing these drawings, these sketches, things from life and stuff like that. And I would sit in on classes because when my mom had me, I have an older sister. She was still in college. Mm-hmm. So sometimes, they couldn't find a babysitter. She would take us to the class. So I was in art school for a very long time. It's kind of tired of it, when I finally actually got there as a college student. But we went to a Amir Baraka talk.
Wow. And
I might have been a little older, maybe 7. And I did a sketch of him, or drawing while he was speaking. And then after, we went to go speak with him after the whole talk and presentation. And he was like, "Oh, this is wonderful. Look at my sketch." He was like, "Looks like you might want to be an artist, or what do you want to be?" And I was like, "I'm already an artist."
Wow.
So that was a comment when I was, really, really young. I do remember
all my artist friends are going to love that. All my creative friends are going to be like, I have somebody I know right now. She's listening. She's going to love that. That was for you.
I love it. And there was always this thing in my mind, like the idea of making was just so impressive to me. Right? The idea of doing something with your hands, just seeing the meaningful.
Your mom met your dad at the Detroit Institute of Art, and you have a lovely painting at the museum of your grandmother, correct? Mm-hmm. So, and I've shown my mom and my sisters, and they all love the painting. And it's so interesting because that's really, before I told them, I was like, oh, Mario Moore, I know Mario. They're like, oh my God, this is wonderful. I love this painting. So 100 years from now, when people are walking through the museums of the world and they come across a Mario Moore painting, what do you want them to think of your work and your legacy?
I think for me, because I'm always thinking as an artist, right? And I think when I think about paintings that I just can keep going back to, it's like, do they look good? Like, is it like, does the painting really impress you? Like, does what's happening in the actual making of the painting, can you see the hand? Right? I feel like a Velasquez, I can go look at a Velasquez every day.
Really?
I could over and over again, there's Titians that I could just keep going back to. And I think what I would like is that there's a place in art history for me.
Wow, okay.
Right? Where it'd be like, okay, the ideas were great, the concepts were great, what we was talking about was really important, but the way he put a painting together, I think that's what I want.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I can tell you that your work it sparks joy. It sparks, kind of inspiration in my mind, and I know the people that I've seen it, who've seen your work and the discussions, and I can definitely say that you are making your mark, and your voice is truly having an impact. And I thank you for taking the time to talk with me today and help me on my, artistic journey and exploring, art without borders. So thanks, Mario.
Thank you so much.